Yeah, you talked about the fact that there's finite means but infinite possibilities. Like so many words in the English language. There's only 12 notes in a music scale, but no limit to the number of songs you can create. Or
Yeah, so I think that comes from, for those listening who don't know, so I think it comes from Noam Chomsky, that he said that the beauty of language is like you have infinite possibilities with finite means. And the case that I make in the TED talk is that I'm saying, like, because we write software in human language, not to be confused with what we now can do with LLMs, but I meant more just good old-fashioned software engineering. If that is true, that we have infinite possibilities with finite means in language because language changes, that means that we can come up with an infinite number of ideas we can express in software because we use language to write software. And that was kind of the point that I wanted to get across. So I think it's a hyper creative medium, right? So we can come up with, we can write down and execute.
well, it's weird because we are limited by sort of the physical world still. I mean, yeah, you could write software that does anything, but before we had these big GPUs, we didn't have LLMs. Right. So we sort of needed like these physical innovations to occur before we could express certain ideas. What's another example? Like, Steve Jobs always wanted to be able to put music in his pocket, but it wasn't until hard drives and storage got miniature enough that he could actually make an iPod.
Yeah, but so, and I, at the risk of now sounding too esoteric.
Esoteric's good.
Okay, so I leave the whole, when I talk about these kind of things, more from a, if you go into that philosophical realm, I leave the whole practicality out of it. So the Steve Jobs example of I want to be able to put music in my pocket, right? That was like the reason he could say that was because he knew that was possible, right? So it's in like, it's more it was the idea that was important. Like, hey, you can walk around with a library of music in your pocket, meaning like you can take the music everywhere. That was, in my opinion, way more important than being limited by that you couldn't do it. Even further, I think that even if we now create businesses and that kind of stuff, especially in the early days, we thinking about what's not possible, that's just not helpful. So it's perfectly fine to just write down a whole idea and then just completely ignore what's not possible. And of course, my time is like a 99% focused on Weaviate, but then in 1% time, I also read stuff that I'm excited about, or that I see that I see if there's like, might there be like product or business opportunities in the future. And like 2 years ago or something, I was introduced to a paper called Mesh Code. And Mesh Code was a paper that was at the University of Kent. And what the paper basically described was like, it was a theory around storing the binary information in protein, in taline, in the brain. And so the research said that maybe that's how the brain encodes
like memories.
And I got interested in that, and I just read the papers. The guy published another paper, so I was reading this too. So I started to play around with it. I was like, hey, that's super interesting, because if you just leave the memories in the brain out of it, but we just said like, hey, we can take taline and we just, encode information in it through light and those kind of things. That's like significantly cheaper than in storing a petabyte binary in a protein. Is significantly cheaper than doing that on a...
And very small too.
And very small too. So, and then I just, during a weekend or something, I just spend some time on, write it down. And I just try to envision what that might look like in the form of product. But I don't care about what's possible or what's not possible. I just first write it down, and then that's something that sits then in my brain. And then by writing it down, I kind of offload it from my brain, and it sits just somewhere in my Google Drive. And I have all kinds of those kind of ideas, right? And I just write them down. But I feel very comfortable not being concerned about what's not possible, because if you're like, that's probably not possible, then...
Well, I didn't mean it in that way. I meant it more in the sense of like, until this new technology is invented, there's like ideas we never even thought of as being possible. Not that we thought about them, but they weren't possible. But like, it's kind of like when a new word becomes a thing. Well, now I have a new thought that I couldn't even think of before because there was no word for it.
Exactly. And I think we can even do this in a little thought experiment, because if I'm saying, so the example that I just gave, right? If we just have like a little one by one where we have like all these, we structure all these proteins on it, and then through light or laser or something, we can read it and we can write it. That doesn't sound too science fictional, right?
No. It sounds possible.
Exactly. And then sure, and there's now probably somebody listening who knows way more about that stuff than I do. But then that this person that must say, oh yeah, but we can't do that because X, Y, or Z. But it doesn't sound unreasonable. And then going back to the previous thing, right? So it's a infinite possibilities with finite means. And the first thing we do, like Jobs did with the iPod, we talk about it. And then by talking about it, we think about it and those kind of things. So